Awesome. So now I'll turn it over to you, Mariah, and looking forward to hearing the talk.
All right, thank you, Zach. Hello, my name is Mariah. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and today I'll be talking about telling stories of transitions using nonlinear ENA. And this really just continues off of a promise that I ended with the last ICQE to model ENA, but over a continuous variable. And the end result, it looks like this spaghetti bowl of a plot here. At heart, it's the same idea as regular ENA, but we're trying to capture local patterns in the data instead of global patterns. And every connection has an elbow to it. And the elbow is being placed in the neighborhood where we expect a unit to be if that unit only had a connection between those two things. But to back up to what the question of the paper is, like, how can QE be used to tell a temporal story? And when I say temporal story, what I'm thinking about is works like memoirs or some novels or some longer books of qualitative work, news stories, and so on, as long as they're doing qualitative work, trying to get this rich account of things over something that moves over time, kind of slowly. But what's a story, right? Well, trying to be consistent with a lot of different theories, right? Stories are composed of a set of phenomena and the interweaving between them. When we researchers tell stories, we tell them with like paragraph breaks. We're making the decision to group such and such events together because we believe they share some sense of similarity, and we're going to spend time on that before we move on to the next set. And then we hang those paragraphs together into some larger global narrative structure, and that global structure usually has some meaning, right, to us. It might be like we're going to go through one theme at a time, before versus after, move over time, alternate between two contrasting groups or whatever. And no telling is neutral, and we can deepen our analytic insight as we write, flesh out, and investigate, interrogate why our telling ought to be the right one. So with all that in mind, I see my job as a QE researcher as telling rich qualitative stories whose turns are guided by quantitative features. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to tell the story of my first year on hormone replacement therapy. So it's a story of gender transition. Well, at a grossly literal medical level, right, for trans women who are who are going through hormone replacement therapy or HRT, you take medicine to lower your testosterone and increase your estrogen. But we know there's a lot more like richness to that and social meaning to that. And I cannot recommend more the works of Julia Kay, which is first a comic diary of her first year on HRT, and then later on a comic diary of random 6 months into 3 years. And in this, she's trying to give an honest account of each day in comic book form. And before I came to her work, I did a similar thing, keeping notes on my notes app on my phone, just trying to keep track of how I felt about things, how things were going, and so on. And I was keeping these notes as I was learning QE method. So after doing a year of HRT, I was like, well, I can go back and reflect on this. I've been reflecting on it the whole time, and I coded it, and I drop it into ENA in this little linear plot, and it's so affirming to see happiness put in kind of contrast to the days when I was skipping doses and not feeling that happy, but it's not really getting the story right. It's affirming, but it's not right, because happiness is being pulled to the side, and that's really not what the goal of the story is. It's happiness and connection and progress. And also the start of the story isn't skipping doses, it's tracking them. So what is a story of transition? There's this awesome paper that pulls together a lot of literature on theorizing transitions in general, whether they're gender transition, becoming a mother, getting a new job, moving countries, or so on. And all throughout these transitions have a sense of time that moves in ebbs and flows, and it's pockmarked by these critical events. And as Julia Kay says, transitions are turbulent as well as mundane. So what I need to get this story right is a model that can capture the lumpiness as time as a thing that is experienced. And I need a global narrative structure and a way to decide on what the paragraphs of the story will be, because being a temporal story, I don't have a priori groups to move through. So let's model lumpy time. This is how I think about it. I have this matrix. Every column is one day. All the rows are the connections that are from the ENA model. And this is the ENA model that we're already getting, is just transposed. And I'm adding a row representing the day number to this space. And then all this is normalized so that each row is contributing the same weight to the model. That's then projected down in a non-linear way. Normally ENA projects down in a linear way. And this tries to capture local patterns. So even though this is like a roadkill plot of the mammoth, locally it still makes sense, right? Even globally, though, it's getting things wrong. And so then to help us make sense of the resulting plot, I want to overlay the network into it. So as said earlier, right, I'm embedding the network so that the elbows of the lines are put in a one-hot encoding, right? They're placed in the neighborhood of units where I expect a unit to be if it only had that one connection. And then I'm embedding the nodes the way that we already do in ENA to give a sense of whatever global structure is there. I say a sense of global structure, such as in here, I'm moving in time in this kind of curly way. And it's capturing this like pattern I had in my experience of bouncing back and forth between these two kinds of periods. And the linear plot just did not capture that at all. Next, to help give me a sense of paragraph breaks, a way I can unfocus my rereading of the data one group at a time, I take that UMAP space, that nonlinear space, and then run it through a density-based clustering algorithm. And this is the result, right? I get this plot with each group laid out like this, and I can, the way that we normally do it, I can then pull out one group at a time and reread it. And then now that I have groups, I can return back to the linear space and start comparing them. So what does a story of transition look like when you're doing this? Well, long answer, just go read the paper. Stories that move over time take time to tell and time to read. But to give highlights, right? The story starts here in this green time period. And during this, I had started HRT and I was tracking a lot of things, and I was taking a lot of notes on just everything because I wasn't sure what might be helpful to note. And kind of what stood out is I have these moments here where I'm writing the time and I'm writing what medicine I'm taking, right? So that's the dose tracking. During this orange period, I had doubts. I was skipping doses. I went for a lot of walks. And thought about QE. And I didn't take as many notes during that period. And it looks like this, a lot of nothing. I did have other apps where I did collect data though. And I bounced back and forth between these a lot. And yes, I was making progress, but not as much as I wanted. And I was having a lot of doubts. And then I kind of call this the back of my bullshit period because I was still thinking about stopping hormones. And I noticed that I was having those thoughts every time I was about to go get refills on my prescriptions. And I talked with my doctor about that. I said, well, let's just move you to a 3-month supply. And that was the critical event that moved me out of that back and forth kind of unhealthy cycle to being able to just live my life. And I stopped tracking doses because I was just taking them, right? It wasn't important to me, but instead I could have these more meaningful reflections on things and just live and get more clothes and experiment with makeup and stuff. Until the end of the year of study, I wasn't even reflecting anymore, right? I'm just like jotting things I thought made me happy and then I'd move on with my day. And when I return back to linear space, we do see these same differences, right? Green versus orange, right? One's more dose tracking, one's more skipping doses. There's also this connection to happiness, no connection to progress here because giving up is its own form of happiness in a way. From the green to the dark pink, right? I'm moving from dose tracking into a stronger connection between happiness and progress. And then from the dark green to the light, the dark pink to the light pink, just a lot of connections to progress and happiness. So my goal was to ask and answer, like, how can QE be used to tell a temporal story and really just get an idea of what that kind of research looks like. And I had a method, I had data that was really personal, and I was going to let the fact that it was personal stop me from telling the story. And I wanted to do it in a way that I saw aligned with what I see my role as a QE researcher, which is telling qualitative stories whose terms are guided by quantitative features. And yeah, I hope I have demonstrated this idea of thinking about transitions and stories in a way that's lumpy, right? It's not from point A to point B. There's a lot of mess in the middle that I want to be able to account for and model. And using linear ENA, I wasn't able to do that, but making things nonlinear, I was. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mariah, for the wonderful presentation. So next up, again, we'll hold questions to the end and when everyone's done presenting. Next up, we're gonna have Amanda Baraney, who will be talking about choosing units of analysis in temporal discourse. So I will let you take over, Amanda.
Great.
Great job staying on time so far.
Let's hope that I can stick to that. I tend to get.
Don't mess it up.
I'll say. Feel free to call me out. And I'm so happy that we get to present after Mariah, not only because that's really fascinating and impactful work, but also because we're talking about how you can use epistemic networks to understand temporal discourse as well. So to get right into it, here, let me move this. There we go. You've got a data set and it's chronological. You know, it's a discourse that's happening from one point to another in time, and you want to understand what the changes look like. So what do? You break it up into chunks. And when you visualize those chunks, each one represents a particular unit of time in that data set. And there we go. And when you visualize those in an epistemic network, you can track visually the movement of each of the means from time 1 to time 2 to time 3 to time 4, and it shows a trajectory of change that you can understand about how, in this case, a Prime Minister Abe from Japan, how he is reflecting in relation to the constructs that would be overlaid in this model. And so this way you can track a temporal trajectory over time and understand how he is moving from different patterns of engagement with different constructs in a single speech. But then the question becomes, what do each of these time units actually mean? There's research to suggest that it's really important, if you're going to be generating epistemic networks around these different time units to understand a temporal trajectory, that these different units have some important thematic meaning behind them, that it's not just something that's standardized, that it's grounded in the discourse underneath. So for this case, you know, time 1 could be his discussions of government economic policy. Time 2 could be representative of a thematic shift in this speech that he's giving, talking about individual illnesses. And this data set is his discussions of COVID around March of 2020. And so this is the data set that we'll be using to explore different ways that you could identify what these meaningful time units in discourse or temporal data might be, with the goal that you can choose the one that would work for you in whatever data set you have access to. And be mindful about selecting what those units will look like. The data set in question is one that we generated. Junoshima is here, and our colleague Michael Phillips couldn't make it because he's presenting somewhere else. But this was part of our QE COVID workshop data set that we collected, and we downloaded transcripts of speeches. Initially, we compared the patterns of discourse between 2 world leaders. It was Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand and Donald Trump from the United States. And there's a video that Michael led with the support of the QE team, David and his team, to show some of the things that we learned from it, comparing those data sets, what their different speeches looked like. But for the second round of the QE data challenge, our goal was to expand that. We wanted to look at a more representative sample of different speeches that different world leaders were giving around that time. And we wanted to cover as many continents and as different types of countries as we could. So this was a matter of trying to search for a lot of different transcripts, seeing if we could find translations, segmenting them, and then going through a process of identifying codes for them. And you'll see that South America, unfortunately, we weren't able to find a transcript for a world leader around this time. So it's not a fully representative sample, but this should give you an idea. You'll also note later on that the Israel transcript was dropped from the data set because it was too short for us to gather anything meaningful in terms of understanding the data. But we have this sample of different transcripts, and we generated 4 overarching a priori codes as a part of this process to understand some of the themes that emerged from the discourse. Those were things like discussions of medical, economic issues, and particularly as it relates to COVID, since that was the time period that we were sampling around. Discussions of social and community, and then discussions of the politics. And this was broken down in each case by casting it in a more positive light or casting it in terms of negative effects. So you'll see that for medical, a positive discussion of medical would be something like valuing emergency workers, affirming the positive benefits of things like social distancing, whereas medical negative would be, struggling with a lack of protective equipment or hospital overflow. And so this is how we broke down these codes for the data set. And you'll see a little bit of this, but for the purposes, there we go. Sorry, I'm having problems moving from one slide to another. For the purposes of breaking up this data into meaningful time units that we could then use to understand the temporal trajectories of each of these world leaders' speeches, we tried 3 different ways to do this. And what we would argue in many cases, the gold standard perhaps approach might be an interpretive one, where you read through the data set, you read through each line of the transcript to understand where thematic shifts might be happening. And from that close grounded reading of the data, you can identify seeing, for example, here, Shinzo Abe's shift in time 1 from a discussion of government economic policy to more of a discussion of individual illnesses as they are happening in COVID. And so this was something that we did for the first round of breaking this up into meaningful time units that we could then visualize. The pro of this kind of interpretive approach is that it's deeply grounded in the discourse. And it involves, really engaging with what is being said thematically to identify these meaningful breaks. But the con is that it's very time consuming. Even for these smaller data sets, it took us quite a while to identify these thematic breaks. So what do you do if your data sets are huge, hundreds or even thousands of lines long? An approach that we've seen used in some data examples is an incremental one. So if you just want to get a basic picture of trajectory over time, you can pick a standard unit, and every X number of lines, you can create another unit break there. So we also tried breaking the data up by every 10 lines of speech was a new temporal unit that we could then visualize. And of course, the pro of that is it's easy to apply to big data sets or complex data sets, but a con is that it's not necessarily sensitive to the nuances of the discourse that you're trying to visualize. These chunks of time don't mean anything in terms of the person's discussions. And then finally, we tried another approach that we hope is marrying some of the best of both of these techniques, which is the knowledge building discourse explorer developed by Dr. Oshima and his team. And I don't know, June, if you want to talk a little bit more about KBDEX and the approach that you used and what its intended functions would be.
No, we don't have time to do that. Just go ahead. Then
Okay.
I can answer the question.
Okay, of course. So essentially, it's trying to automate through an automated process, identify where these breaks in the discourse might be that can be applied to a larger data set, but doesn't require you to go through the data in detail. How am I doing on time? Am I over? Quite a bit, I bet. So this is the model.
You're okay.
Thank you. So this is an overlay of the means for the models for each of the countries when the 3 approaches are applied: interpretive, incremental, and the KBDEX approaches. And you can see that there is some clustering, fortunately, I guess, for each of the countries' means, but that in some cases, such as France, for example, you can see that the interpretive approach is lining up really closely with the KBDEX approach. And in some cases, the incremental approach is lining up closer, such as at the bottom, you'll see the United States, and KBDEX is actually pretty far away in terms of the spatial location here. And we wanted to understand what might be happening in the cases where KBDEX is doing perhaps a better job of representing the interpretive approach as compared to the incremental approach. So here's a breakdown of the cuts made to the units identified in the French data for interpretive, KBDEX, and incremental approaches. And basically, the main point that unit break that KBDEX did not identify is the one in the interpretive that is between unit 3 and unit 4 of the time. And that signifies in the data set, the French leaders' discussions from let's have everyone come together and work towards ending COVID. And then from 3 to 4, he starts talking about it as a war. And so there was a clear thematic shift when you look at the data that we identified interpretively that KBDEX did not pick up on, but this could be because of similarities in the discourse before and after this break. So something that we were able to identify thematically, maybe it's not picking up. You can also see that neither of the 2 approaches, automated, KBDEX or incremental, picked up on the introductory piece at the very beginning. And that piece actually doesn't end up lining up well in the model. So because it's so small, that time unit 1 doesn't actually have any associations drawn across it. But you can see that these trajectories are relatively similar, but we've got this little jog in the interpretive approach between unit 2 and unit 3. And unit 2 is time unit 2 is talking about thanking our healthcare workers And time unit 3 is saying, now we need to come together and do our part. And these are the kinds of things that you as French citizens need to do. So they're thematically distinct, but they're both talking about, no, that's too far there. They're both talking about the medically negative consequences of the current situation and how these medical people can help and how we can play our part to alleviate some of these medical issues. And you can see that that little thematic jog is more closely represented between times 1 and 2 for the KBDEX approach. And you can see that the incremental approach kind of steamrolls through that little important thematic piece of the data in terms of understanding the temporal shifts. And so you can also see that there is really close alignment towards the end of the speech. So KBDEX perfectly matches the unit breaks from the final 2 units identified in the data set. Whereas the incremental approach, like I said, is just breaking it up into standardized chunks. And so it's not picking up on some of those thematic nuances. So now let's look at the United States and see what's happening there and why KBDEX is so far away. And what we noticed when we looked at the data, first of all, it's very short. It's 17 lines long. And that's because we had to drop the question and answer portion of President Trump's speech because it was too complex to be using some of these approaches. And this is only his initial speech. And it's a very homogeneous and cyclical pattern of discourse that he's using. And as a result, some of these shifts that you'll see in the final model from, where is it? From everything is great politically and everything is great economically in time 1 to everything is great medically, therefore, and then finally over to everything is great social and community wise. You can see that KBDEX isn't picking up on those 3 areas of nuance in his speech. Come on now, there we go. And it only identifies a meaningful time unit break right at the end when he says, thank you to the attendees for listening to his speech. Everything else is identified as relatively homogeneous in how he is speaking. And so that's something to consider when you're doing any automated approach is that it may not be picking up on some of those nuances depending on the type of discourse. So ultimately, there's pros and cons to any of these 3 approaches that you may choose to use. If you're looking at temporal data and you want to identify meaningful time units, interpretive is grounded, but it's time consuming. Sometimes it can generate units that are too small to actually be contributing to an understanding of the times. Incremental is great for large data sets, but it might smooth out some of the nuance that the interpretive approach is highlighting. And KBDEX is data-driven and it can be good for large data sets, but it may not be particularly useful for some of the smaller data sets, like the United States data set of only 17 lines, or with certain types of discourse styles, like those are overly homogeneous. But this comes with some of the things that we'd like to address moving forward. And limitations to this study also are, the differences in the sizes of each of these transcripts. So there's limited representativeness that we tried to alleviate, but there's still not a full representation across all countries or continents. And also we haven't included any representations of transcripts or interviews of more than 2 individuals. So some of these have 2 people speaking, but we did not include anything like a Q&A or an open forum discourse. That would be something interesting to explore possibly moving forward. And also we want to look at this piece of like when someone is speaking in a very specific way that makes it difficult for an automated processor to pick up on thematic breaks. What are things that we can do to try to automate the modeling of that? I'm sure I'm over time, but thank you so much. Thank you to my co-authors and collaborators on this project who were here and those who could not make it. And I welcome any questions on these techniques that we applied.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll take those questions at the end. Very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. And so we will finish up last but not least. Jen Ciano is going to talk to us about approaching structured debate with QE in mind. We're still pretty good on time, so no worries there. So I'll turn it over to Jen.
So I don't have to talk like I'm running the marathon?
No, I mean, try to keep it around 10 minutes, but since we only have 3 presentations, we're not as strapped as we might be. So it's okay.
Perfect. Yeah, so welcome. I just want to thank everyone for coming. So today I'm going to be talking about the nuances of structured debate specifically, some of the implications when you're working with structured debate and trying to use QE methods, and all of that as part of a reflection of my team's experiences during the COVID data challenge of spring 21. So before I get started, I feel the need to define like, what do we mean by structured debate? So there's 3 key features of structured debate. The first being that there are positions. there has to be position taking, whether you're saying that you're pro or con to an initial statement, or for or against, or supporting and refuting. There has to be different positions that are coming together to debate. The second key feature is that turn taking. So typically in a round structured debate, you have one side that gets to present their position, and then the other side gets to refute. Then you can have the other side present theirs, and there's a refutation. And that's one form of turn taking and a structure to go along with it. In our case, we saw turn taking and the third rigid structure of participation in a more branching pattern. And so we were really interested in pursuing this as a novel discourse type, because there have been a number of online structured debate platforms that popped up. And when we wanted to look at the heated debate around COVID, we, as our team, did not want to look at Twitter debate again. So this is a different type of platform than what you see debate happening in social media like Twitter and things like that, because each of these claims that are made by a participant have to follow that community or discourse structure that's embedded in structured debate. So to begin reviewing our QE process, we want to spend quite a bit of time actually talking about the data curation and preparation, because that is really where our team put most of our effort into really understanding what happens in this form of discourse. So we observed a structured debate via an online platform, and it was related to COVID-19 and herd immunity. The details of that discussion aren't really that important, because the greater finding that we had was that the more that we were interested in the content of the discussion, the more that we began to dig into the data, the more that we began to question what exactly is happening with positionality and structure. And these were the more intriguing questions that relate more to like structured debate in general. So these questions that we present are fairly generic, but we bring them to you in hope to show how not only this manifested in our work with our data set, but also how it could generically apply to others' data sets as well. We first began this process because we were so interested in content by just starting with the simple claims. So each of these, as I mentioned before, in a structured debate of this branching nature, there's an initial statement that everybody's responding to. And from that initial statement, we have these individual claims that are made afterwards. With those claims, we started to code using IROC to generate our codes and to designate our metadata. We started with our content codes and evidence codes because we were really interested in misinformation as one thing, but also how are people using evidence and citing their sources, bringing in these news articles and links to lend credibility to the things that they're talking about in content. As we began to explore those, these other structural components, such as relevance, which is a measure of like how closely related your claim or the individual claim is to the overall initial statement, became more and more relevant. We also went through and coded for position and what we refer to as concord and discord. The reason that position became important is that when we have this initial statement, they're usually stated positively, so in a pro stance. When you have these initial claims that respond to them, we can see that we have this one here. The first one could be a con, and it's a con that's responding to a pro statement. So the position of that actually makes sense. The true meaning of it is that it's a con. What we notice, though, is that the further you go into the discourse, such as claim 3, it's self-described as a con, but because it's responding to a con, it's actually more of a pro stance, and so it doesn't quite agree with itself. And we call those situations that arise in the discourse discord as an actual code. So we look at times when the position makes sense, such as number 1, and times when the position doesn't make sense, calling that discord within the claim itself. because of this like wrestling that we had to do with positionality and the way that it was manifesting in the data, we started to ask other questions about the structure of the data and really checking our assumptions of what we believe to be the case of like how these things were even connected. And so initially when we looked at a branching structured debate, we thought, oh, this is a threaded data set. But it's not really, because these threads, typically when we think of something that's threaded, it's that every response is deeper and deeper into that same topic. And in these structured debates, they tend to actually be divergent. So a child or a response claim, so number 3, for example, down here, is actually potentially something that's more along the lines of, oh, but have you considered this other divergent or tangential thing? And there's not a relationship truly to potentially the initial claim, and usually not a sibling relationship to number 4. The only guarantee that we have then about the relationships between claims is that they're familial. So each claim that is made has a parent, whether that's the initial statement, claim 1 having the parent of the initial statement and having the children of 3 and 4. And we really try to stay within those familial relationships as how we can draw the leaps that are being made from one to the other. Which brought up another question. If we think about family trees, we often think about the things at the top of the tree happened first. And that's not necessarily guaranteed in structured debate. I've renumbered our claims on this slide just to give us an idea that we could have an entire branch that goes down to claim 1, claim 2, claim 3, and even building on that to claim 4 before we ever return up to the initial statement and start a whole new branch. And because of that, we would find ourselves getting like into these discussions about, oh, well, at the bottom of the tree over here, it looks like the discussion led this way. And unless we have the metadata, the timestamp to actually prove that that's true, the only thing we can assume is that their parent, grandparent, great-grandparent claim came before them. We can't assume any of the things that are lateral to the claim that we're investigating happened at the same time. So what does that mean for how we are actually able to use segmentation to designate relationships between claims? Well, we could look at how far away a claim is from the initial statement. We could do that by level. We could consider how those familial relationships manifest. How do things stay on topic or not stay on topic? We could consider perhaps a threaded model if it seems like the structured debate really is diving deeper and deeper into the same issues. Or if we're just interested in how broad the topic goes throughout the structured debate, we could consider the entire debate as one segment. In order to actually facilitate that type of segmentation, we have to have the metadata to do so. So one of the things that we really worked on for our project was thinking about how do we create that metadata from pretty non-specific, a pretty non-specific starting point. So we have to have this unique ID to represent each claim that allows us to use them as an individual utterance within the ENA model. The second thing, as I mentioned, we have these position claims and alignment codes that help us to understand whether when we say that something is a pro, is it really a pro? We also added a level, which, as I mentioned, it's how far away from that initial statement is the claim in question. So you can see that here we're 1.1.1.1, and that's in a level 4 because you're 4 spaces removed from that initial claim. We can use how many children and how many descendants overall something has, just to show how much that led to more discussion, and we can use the codes themselves. What we're really trying to do with creating all of this metadata is take the chaos of a lot of different data types and organize it so that we can better utilize it within models. So some of our examples here is how did discourse change as a result of level? Well, if we looked at level 1, the claims that are just right after the initial statement, we see that there's a strong connection between public health measures and not including a reference in the claim. So not including a link to a website, no other additional supporting information is there. But when we get to level 5, that connection actually disappears. And instead, we have a strong connection between public health measures and external references, meaning that people were including links. It seems like this is likely because as the discourse continues, like things are getting more and more divergent in terms of the types of evidence that people are using. So things that are assumed to have a common starting ground in the beginning become need more and more evidence to help support them as they're introduced to the arguments later on. We also verified that the position changes in that like agreement or concord and discord throughout the levels. So in level 1, right after the initial claim, all of the positions are in concordance with what we expect them to mean. By the time we get to level 3, it's more often that we are in discordance where the positions don't really make sense for what we assume them to mean. So some takeaways about structured debate is really that these relationships matter. And that's what we felt the need to come to ICQE and share with the community, is that the way that you craft this metadata is essential for how you're able to analyze it later on. And in order to like make the best decisions, you have to consider what is meaningful for the question at hand. So for us, it made the most sense to actually consider level as our grouping variables. And so we had to have metadata that allowed us to group by level. Also, when you're analyzing these debates, positionality cannot actually be accepted at face value. So you have to make sure that not only if people are self-describing their position, what are they describing their position in response to? So that you understand that full relationship of claim to the parent claim, to their parent claim, all the way up to the initial statement. But it's a really interesting discourse structure and useful for issue framing and looking at different ways that people debate in online platforms. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. Cool. So thanks everyone for the great presentations. So now we have about at least 20 minutes for questions and discussion. We can go a little bit over if we need to. So I'll open the floor for questions either to any particular panelist or the panel as a whole. If you have a question, just maybe raise your hand in the chat and then we'll organize it from there. Awesome. So I see that Sylvie has a question. We'll let you get started kicking us off then.
Thank you. Actually, I want to congratulate everyone who just presented. Awesome job, everyone, seriously, and very, very interesting project. I'd like to hear a little bit from June about the tool, if that's possible. It was kind of promised to us, so I'm just, checking in on that promise.
Well, yeah, I'm quite, actually my team and also Amanda and Mike were just all quite interested in the concept of stanza. It's really easy for human beings to just detect from the discourse segments, but I feel how hard it is for computers to detect. For instance, the results just about critical differences between human cognitions and perceptions of the discourse and automatic detection of the stanza or just a sequence of conversation tones from the exactly the same discourse data. So because in our approach here, I mean, by using the KBDEX, only thing we can do or we could do was to detect sequence of conversations on the basis of topic, but not based on intentions of human speech. Then what we did was to just segment total discourse data into several small sets by seeing to continuous decrease of the matrix. This matrix is just the total value of the degree centrality of the network structure of words in speech. So once you see the decrease, oh, that will be the point for speakers to change their topic of the discourse. Then go up again because he or she talks about different topics. So the total discourse is assumed to be a sequence of different lengths of the stanzas relating to the different topics. Sometimes the speaker just went back to the original topics, but we can detect different segments like this. Then, so if we're going to use this kind of technique, you don't have to sliding. You don't have to conduct any sliding because once you can detect the segment as a kind of like a stanza, you can just check the connection of the codes within the stanza, then try to calculate a Jiangxi table to create the two-dimensional epistemic frames. But as you saw, we still have the critical differences between the human perceptions and the automatic detection. So we're going to have to be very careful about it. Particularly, we're dealing with very brief discourse where the speakers talk about, elegantly talks about the differences and the topics. So we could not detect any differences, it kind of segmentations in Trump's speech.
Sorry, can I just have a follow-up question? So can you take a step back and say what the stanzas would be based on? So is it some kind of word count?
Yeah. So
or
we can calculate this matrix on the basis of the list of or vocabularies representing the topics in the discourse. So we can create the list of the vocabulary on the basis of the original discourse data. You can detect, any kind of nouns or verbs or adverbs or whatever you like. Then calculate co-occurrences within a sentence or conversation tones of those selected words. Then calculate the degree centralities of them. So it's very simple algorithm, but it's really pervasive one used in the network science. Then the one special feature for the KBDEX is we could implement it temporality by using the lifetime of links between nodes. So in this case, you can see the decrease, the radical decrease of the value because any links between the nodes, once established, is going to be diminished if that connection was not appear in the next term.
Just
So
one more question.
Sure.
On the y-axis, what is that metric?
Metric is a total value of degree centrality. So it's sort of like how connected to each other between nodes in a simple term. Then once the connection didn't appear in the next conversation term, that connection was diminished automatically. So that's why you see the wave like this.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Very exciting.
Thanks very much.
Awesome. So the next question I saw is from Hanal. So Hanal, do you want to give your question?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for brilliant presentation from all presenters. I have also one question for Amanda and June. I think as far as I understand the results, the segmenting temporal units work as conversation in UNA, like meaning that the moving stanza window sliding only within a certain time period. Is it correct?
Yeah. So it's Yeah, we see actually the standard threading message is quite powerful and also very appropriate for us to use for a big size of the data. But also we still have a, sort of like a problem with the length of the unit. For instance, once you set, okay, the default size is going to be a 5, you cannot change. Then just the size of the window of the size is going down from the top to the bottom. So it's quite reasonable sometimes because you cannot miss anything if you're going to use that kind of technique. But sometimes, it's sort of like an issue of the type 1 and type 2 error of the statistics. So, but automatic segmentation by using the KBDex, we try to create different sides of the stanza on the basis of the topic speakers talked about. Amanda, do you have any questions? Sorry.
Yeah, so I think, so what the 3 approaches we used are breaking this data, which is organized chronologically by speaker, by speech, into meaningful chunks, essentially. They're a chronological ribbon, we're breaking it up into pieces. Now, you could conceivably use those breaks as conversations. So you could say that the conversation in this data set is going to be these lines, and at these lines, across these lines, meaningful connections will not be drawn. But we didn't want to do that here because it's important that we consider the whole speech as a single piece of discourse. So we actually set the conversation by speaker only. We considered each speech as one long stanza. And what we did use these temporal units that we identified, we used them as ways to break up the meaningful time units. So for the speech, so we set the unit of each model as the variables that were determined by these 3 approaches. Does that make sense? You could use them as conversations, but we did not do that here.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I was just gonna say, in effect, it ends up doing the same, kind of the same thing. So it's basically what you were describing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and if time allows, can I maybe I can pass the mic to Kate, and then if we need more time.
And we'll loop back around. Okay, Kate.
So I have a question for Jen and your authors, and it's kind of asking you to speculate. But as you were going through the data, did you get the impression that people read the siblings and the siblings' children, or did they just read the parent and then respond?
That is a great question. And so that's actually one of the reasons why we made it so explicit of the structured debates are not threaded, because as we started to explore, some of this is actually just our own interaction with the platform itself, is that as you navigate that platform, you're encountering different parts of the debate. And sometimes you lose a sense of how far away you are from that initial statement, because you might be 3 levels down, and the way that it's depicted at the top of the page shows that as being the parent with all the children, because there's still a whole bunch of children and grandchildren. And so because of that, I think that people were navigating it much more sporadically than systematically, like you would a thread on Reddit, for example, where you're reading something and you're literally responding directly to that, and probably responding to the thread or the comment that's right above yours. Because of the way that they were positioned on the screen, it was much harder for people using the site to actually take into account what the siblings were saying. And just the nature of the debate itself was that you don't have to disprove the siblings or support the siblings. You're trying to respond directly to the parent claim. And And so that has its own implications as well. any other teammates are welcome to respond as well.
Yeah, it's the first thing that popped into my head, Jen, was like, we arrived at that by seeing how others see the threads. That's really what drove, yeah. Anything, Sylvie?
Oh, I just want to quickly add that we used this type of coding in the ROC, where we had a code called Relevance, and we had a way to indicate how relevant a specific comment, a specific statement was to the initial claim. And we defined that based on, there was a self-generated description of the initial claim. So we kind of coded that. And then whichever code appeared in the statements following that, that was used to determine how close it was. So we had relevance 1, which was super relevant, relevance 2, not so relevant, relevance 3, not relevant at all. So we use that as another indicator of what you're talking about, Kate. But my subjective impression is, I don't remember exactly what we got in the results, but my subjective impression, just because I use this platform sometimes with classes, no one reads it. Like they'll just add a new claim and it'll be very similar to something that someone's already said, and no, they don't.
I really like that strength of a code thing.
Awesome.
Thanks.
So Jamie, did you also have a question?
Yeah, I do. I have a question for Mariah. And so I'm wondering, I'm wondering if you can share the experience with us about being a participant in your own research, and perhaps maybe whether or not you came across any ethical considerations or biases that you've had to come up against going through that process.
Yeah. So I started HRT like as I was starting David's QE class. And for the longest time, those were just two separate things, right? But I got far enough into working with David over the summer and stuff, and I was like, I wonder if like, how do my own experiences look at this, right? Because I was looking at other people's data, I'm looking at other people's data all the time and doing QE models and data that other people collect and stuff. And I was like, but how would it look on my own data? And I tried modeling it. I'm like, this just isn't getting it right. So there was something, a fundamental experience that wasn't being captured. It took a lot of thought and reading other literature and stuff to get at what it was. That theory paper I owe a lot of kind of offloading of labor to, both to them and then to like the wealth of research that he cites. I'm just conceptualizing transitions in general, but I also talk about like damage-based frameworks and stuff. Like the existing literature on trans experiences also isn't that great because a lot of it is based around idea of damage and kind of escaping damage. But if all you've done is characterize a community's damage, when you're done, that's all you've left them with. So to get kind of over that without just being like, oh, well, here's how I experienced it, right? I drew a lot on like the feminist approaches to auto ethnography, where I didn't just look at my notes, right? I had like a, what is it? Assemblage or whatever. I can't remember the word off the top of my head, but I had a lot of things that I was drawing and comparing with to triangulate. So that's why in the slides, I have all those selfies. Because that was kind of part of my data, is going back and looking like, well, how did I like look, right? Like it's good to look back and see yourself change in retrospect too. And I had all the notes from my doctor at the time. I have all my lab results that I looked at. But just kind of seeing the story evolve and trying to tell the story in a way that, one, the structure is coming from it quantitatively in a way that it is getting the story right. And also it's helping me see more than what I could have seen qualitatively alone. That's what I was getting at. I wasn't trying to give saturation or evidence. Like I wasn't trying to get a stat score for what I already knew. I was trying to go beyond that. And so I tell this story around the critical point of the email from my doctor, because that I can measure as a critical point. But before I ran the model, I didn't know what that was going to be. I thought maybe coming out to my advisor would be important. I thought when I quit caffeine halfway through the pandemic, that'd be important because I was just less anxious because of that. There's all these things I didn't know whether or not I should even talk about them, because I wasn't sure like the structural importance to the data. And instead, a lot of those things just get wrapped up into this is what progress looks like. And so when I tell the story in the paper, that's what I focus on, what progress looks like in the different periods of time. And I'm only able to structure it that way because of the modeling. And so I have a really confident understanding of my first year on HRT. And I kind of stopped taking notes after that because I said, all right, I'm done with this. Like, I'm just going to go do other stuff now. So yeah, that's kind of how it's been. It was a lot of trying to draw on other people's research, but understand what the limitations that is, and being very careful about what the goal of even doing this was for myself.
Awesome. So perhaps I have one maybe final question for the official time, and then we can keep going if folks still have some other questions. So one thing I noticed about all of these papers is that they point out a limitation of the existing ENA method, right? And so I was curious as to how that journey came about for you. Like Mariah, you mentioned that you tried regular ENA first and realized is it not working. And I'm curious if that was kind of the path other people followed, or if you were like, no, I know from the beginning that I want to, that it's not doing this. So kind of if any of you could talk about that journey a little bit, I think it could be helpful for us.
So let me start with my experience. Actually, I met David many years ago because we're interested in each other's work. For instance, I was quite impressed by the very much first paper of the ENA and the ethnographic studies work published in early 2000 or something. Then at the same time, we published the first paper of the KBDEX and other place. So David was fortunately quite interested in our work. Then we met each other at a conference in Singapore. Then while we discussing about algorithm behind the application, we found out, we had quite different epistemic stances on very similar algorithms. Then, the temporality is one of the big issues for us to discuss. Then we implemented the lifetime of the connections of the nodes. Then David and his team was implemented the quite elegant stanza window sliding method. So that's the beginning for us to discuss about it.
Awesome. Mariah or Jen,
Go ahead.
or yeah, Amanda. Anyone?
Sure. Well, I love messing around with temporal data. I love visualizing those trajectories of change. I just think that's always fascinating. And I was lucky enough to be paired with June and Michael and the rest of our team during the QE challenges. And when I've published papers before, we're looking at that used incremental chunking of data. And I always felt that it was a bit artificial, like you're just sort of imposing a structure to try to get a sense of change over time. But there's a lot of problems with, in my view, using that approach. And I've had data where I've had no choice, but it always kind of rankled me. And so when June shared with me this KBDEX technique, and of course, when we talked about using an interpretive technique for identifying unit breaks or temporal breaks in the data, it really was answering a question I hadn't really conceptualized yet. And I just think that there's any place you can be intentional in how you build your model and bring it back to how your data is structured and how it makes sense is going to improve the outcomes of your understanding and what the model gives you. And so that's what really spoke to me about trying out KBDEX and seeing how it works in this applied case.
I just want to build off of that because I think that exactly what Amanda said, I have to give a lot of credit to Sylvie because she is a mastermind of all things metadata in terms of helping to really think about what affordances there are for certain types of metadata and really having a grounded understanding of how that metadata will actually manifest when you go to model it. And the more that you understand those connections of if we do things in this way, and we try to add this metadata, and we're going to aggregate across these windows, you can actually check your assumptions with that before you start building models, and go look at your data and say, is that really where we want to be drawing connections between? Are these claims really connected in the way that we would be modeling? And it forces you through that process, and that's what we were really surprised by taking on this novel data set, is that it forced us to really get a better understanding of how our data was constructed in the first place from even a user perspective, and what that meant in terms of how we had to create metadata to explain that construction.
Awesome. So we're at the official time. I'm happy to keep the room open for a little bit longer if there are any other questions, but I also want to let people know that they're free to leave if they want to, and join the community chat. And also you can create side rooms there and continue discussion. So is there anything else that anyone wanted to raise while we're all here?
I'll just say, both of you were talking about like the structure of your data. Mine didn't have any structure. I had to make a whole new version of VNA to support that. Because when I say temporal, I'm talking years of time.
Okay.
When you say temporal, you're talking like a 5-minute speech. I mean, these are two different scales of complexity, but so we're kind of overloading the word temporal there. But that's,
I think that's the
Challenges are similar.
I think
No?
that's the proverbial version of screw it, we'll do it live, I think.
All right. Well, thank you all again for joining the session, and thanks to all our presenters. They did a wonderful job, and thanks for the great questions, guys. So we'll continue to chat throughout the rest of the conference.